Hey everybody, happy Halloween-ish. I was thinking about what I wanted to do over the course of the next few reviews, and I was thinking to myself, you know what? I have always loved horror films, thank you. So why don't I do a bit of a series of horror movie reviews over the next couple of weeks? I thought that might be a fun way of kind of getting into the whole Halloween spirit, seeing as how Halloween is my favorite holiday. You know, it's all about family getting together and, you know, being happy and all the gifts you give to everybody and peace and joy to all the children. So, I thought what better way to start than with a classic. Of course, classic can be thrown around to anything. I mean, people have already deemed Kanye West's little speech at the Video Music Awards as a classic, which, of course, I don't agree with. Really a waste of time. Let's not talk about it. So, for the first of my Halloween-themed reviews, can you tell it's Halloween-themed? I mean, look at all the crazy decorations I've put up. Yeah. You know what? Hold it right there. I think I can make this happen. There we go. Now we're ready to freak some people out. So, we're starting off with An American Werewolf in London. Now, this movie came out in 1981 and is quite possibly one of the best werewolf movies ever made. I mean, it would have to be, otherwise why would I even bother talking about it? This movie was directed by Jonathan Landis, who, if you do not recognize the name, was the director for Animal House and The Blues Brothers. Already you should be a little bit intrigued by this because we're talking about a guy who made some of the most timeless comedies, now is making a horror movie? Really? And it's quite evident that he is in fact the director of this film, because this is one of the few true horror movies that has a real biting sense of humor. I said biting and we're talking about werewolves. It's a pun. Let's move along. There's a lot of great stuff in this film, and I'd like to go ahead and start with what I always start with, a plot synopsis. So, we get to follow the story of young David and his friend John. Now, David and John are visiting England for a couple of weeks, and one of the very first places that they stop off at is a small hometown little pub known as the Slaughtered Lamb. Really charming name. Once they're inside, they meet a group of people who, frankly, are none too happy to see them, and essentially warn them that they need to leave, but when they do, to stick to the streets and stay away from the moors. Well, of course, you wouldn't have a very exciting movie if they didn't stay away from the moors. So what do? They go to the moors. Along the way, they are attacked by a strange wolfen creature. Ooh, what could it be? And after that attack, we don't hear from David until 3 weeks later when he wakes up in a hospital bed. And from there on, we get to see the rest of the story fold out as we see what happens to somebody after they have survived a werewolf attack. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, okay, this is kind of an interesting setup, but it doesn't really sound like much that we haven't seen before, so, you know, it doesn't sound very exciting, but you're wrong! Here's why. This is actually a very compelling tell of the werewolf story, and it's because of a particular way in which major story points are presented. And it's not presented through use of action, and it's not presented through use of set piece, but by the characters that present the story information. Unfortunately, I can't say too much about that because when it happens, it's an awesome surprise. And it's a really powerful way of conveying the story because it comes from a point of view that you're not used to hearing from, especially in a movie of this type. Also, what's interesting about this is that you get to witness a very slow change over David's character as he becomes more and more aware of what it is that is actually happening to him. You end up actually more entertained by it because he is such a human character. The way that he reacts to things are very natural. You don't feel like you're watching people acting. You feel like you're watching somebody going through a real change in their life. Obviously, it's a supernatural change and those kind of things don't exist. Or do they? But much like movies like, say, Let the Right One In, it becomes something where you just pretty much accept it because, let's face it, you're watching a movie called An American Werewolf in London. What do you expect it to be about? Now moving on to the important part, the effects. The effects in this movie were done by Mr. Rick Baker, which is a name you may be familiar with if you've ever seen the original Star Wars film. I am talking, of course, about A New Hope, the one that came out decades ago, not the one that came out a decade ago. Stupid CG nonsense bunch. He created many of the characters in the famous cantina scene. He also since then has had his hand in The Nutty Professor and How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which really don't compare to this, but give you a basic background. Anyway, this film was one of the very first werewolf movies to actually feature a full transformation scene. If anybody has seen the original Wolfman, you will know that the transformation sequence done in that film was done via cross-dissolve. You saw the actor sitting, and then cross-dissolve to cross-dissolve to cross-dissolve, revealing more and more makeup. And of course, that was how it had to be done back in the day, but this is not as back in the day, but is today. It's all relative, really. In this film, you get to see the entire transformation. That's some of the best looking effects that have been done over the course of about the past 30 years. And it is because of the very reason that I mentioned in my Pan's Labyrinth review, physical, practical effects. And I don't care what anybody says, but those will always look better than any computer effect on the planet. Because even if a physical effect doesn't quite ring entirely true, and it seems a little off, at least it's still there. It's still a tangible object. You will never get that with computer-generated effects. You just can't. And I thank God there are films like this that allow us to see where we used to be in filmmaking. And I wish daily that we could make a return to that. Because frankly, I'm sick of seeing all these huge, grandiose effects and displays of computer technology, but they add nothing to the story and they have no practical use other than the ability to just show off that you can do it. What's great about movies like American Werewolf from London and so many other classic monster movies is that they were limited by what they could do physically, and as such they had to make it look that much more convincing. Hours and hours of sitting in a chair getting makeup done, making sure everything is in a perfect position, all for 8 to 10 seconds of film. But it's the best looking thing you've ever seen. And that is why this movie and so many others like it are that much more compelling, because you know just how much work had to go in to get that effect looking right. You couldn't just hit render and then halfway through realize that it wasn't turning out right, so you just stop it, change one little setting, and then go ahead and start it again without having to start from scratch. That wasn't the case. You had to get it right the first time, because if you didn't, then you were looking at hours and hours upon work and work and work that you would have to make up for all the time that you spent on an effect that didn't come out the way you intended. And it makes it that much more compelling to watch, and I implore anyone who cares anything about the history of visual effects and the history of practical effects to see this, because you will witness a transformation scene that honestly hasn't been matched. I mean, if you were impressed by the effects that were done in, say, any of the Underworld films, which I actually am a huge fan of, then believe me when I tell you, it's going to be that much more impressive to see how this film tackles that sort of scene, because it really is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. As far as the rest of the film goes, it moves at a very, very rapid pace. And by rapid, I don't mean that it's like, you know, first we're here, now we're there, now we're there, now we're there, now we're back. I mean, the story moves along at such a great flow that there's never really a point in the movie where you feel like, I really wish we could move on. It doesn't happen, and it only gets better from the point of the movie start. It starts off with such a bang and such an emotional hit that you're thinking to yourself, wow, it really couldn't get much better than this, but it actually does. You are really carried throughout the entirety of the film. Now, I know I said in the beginning of this review that this movie does have a very sharp sense of humor, and that is true. There are parts during the course of this film where I was cracking up, and there are parts of this film where I was rather frightened, admittedly. And that's what's so great about this film. They're able to create this dynamic of bringing humor and horror together so dynamically that it doesn't feel over the top. It actually feels quite natural in many cases, and it actually makes the characters more believable. It truly is something amazing to witness, because it's not something that you see very often, especially in a creature film. Most creature films are all about blood and gore and scaring you and everything else like that. And this movie has its fair share of all those things, which is great, but we're also able to get a hold of the actual story and move along with it. It's only because that humor helps break that tension just a little bit for you. So overall, I would have to say that this is one of the best werewolf films ever made, probably one of the best creature films ever made, and quite frankly, I can't think of much more to say about it. I just hope you get the chance to see it, and I hope that you truly enjoy it. Because let me tell you, you may think that you've seen all that werewolves have to offer, but turns out there is something better than Michael Jackson's Thriller.